David McGlynn's stories are just extraordinary, and we're really in for a treat. And we'd like to thank him for visiting us at Brigham Young University. My regular announcements begin with the please silence your cell phone announcement, so that it does not go off during the reading. I silenced my cell phone. Next week there will be 2 readings. There's an extra reading on Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. in the Special Collections classroom, which is where we have the reception. There will be a reading by Michael Martone, who is a very successful, well-known, and highly regarded creative nonfiction writer in America. So that's 6 p.m. Wednesday in the Special Collections classroom, and there will be books for sale after his reading. And next Friday is the graduate student advanced student reading, which is always one of the very favorites of the year. You will really enjoy it. The winners who will be participating in that reading will be notified today by 5 o'clock. So be looking at your email. It will come by email. This is the brand new issue of Inkscape, our creative writing journal, and it's beautiful, beautiful new format, great design, really fine works of fiction and poetry and creative nonfiction by our own students. It will be available for sale today in the reception after the reading for $5, or you can get them in the English department office. So get your Inkscape now. You'll be glad you did. Today there will be a reception and a book sale after the reading in the Special Collections classroom, so please join us. You'll have the opportunity to meet and talk personally to David McGlynn, and we hope to see you there. Our invocation today will be given by James Goldberg, and then Steve Tuttle, Professor Steve Tuttle, will introduce our visiting writer.
Our Father in heaven, we thank thee that we can be gathered here today and hear words that are seeking for meaning and connection to this life and to thee. We ask thee to bless us in this time and bless us all as we continue to face questions about our lives and the society in which we live. And these things we pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
David McGlynn was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, and grew up in Houston, Texas, and Orange County, California. He studied at the University of California, Irvine, and then received an MA and PhD from the University of Utah, where he also served as managing editor for Western Humanities Review. His fiction and creative nonfiction have appeared in Alaska Quarterly Review, Image, Mid-American Review, Shenandoah, and other literary journals. He currently teaches at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, where he lives with his wife and sons. The End of the Straight and Narrow, his first book of short stories, was published in 2008 by Southern Methodist University Press. Wendell Berry writes that works of art participate in our lives. We are not just distant observers of their lives. They are in conversation among themselves and with us. When we read David McGlynn's stories and essays, they participate in our lives. They show us the world we ought to have seen already, but somehow managed to miss. In his writing, we learn something about ourselves, too. We come to recognize the fears or desires we have tried to ignore, and we may see the hopes we have been hiding, afraid that by giving them a little light, we might scare them away. In McGlynn's writing, we find a knowing voice, sometimes disguised in a character, sometimes not, that tells us how the world works. It tells us that sometimes all of us justify a little airbrushing of the pretense, that sometimes when even the quiet is quiet, we all fear that our deaths will be dark and unobserved. It reminds us that when someone says we are just like family, it means that we are not family at all. That our lives can be filled with the things we want and still manage to be something other than the life we have planned. That we can be surrounded by people we recognize, but not quite. In the great final lines of Borges' Emma Zunes, we read something that reminds us of the feeling of a David McGlynn story. Borges writes that if Emma's story was unbelievable, it still convinced everyone, because in substance it was true. All that was false were the circumstances, the time, and one or two proper names. If we know that the particulars of a short story are invented, McGlynn regularly, constantly makes us forget that anything else is. Because the characters who fill out his pages live lives that we might recognize as our own, but for a few details. These are characters who have learned that guilt is a force equal to love, that the need for human contact is a matter of survival, that truth is a function of story. And perhaps most importantly of all, McGlynn teaches us that a prosthetic eye can still manage to look suspicious and angry. Please welcome David McGlynn.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been something beyond a pleasure to be here. As many of you already know, Steve and I go back a long way, and I've been enchanted and humbled and in many ways frightened by his stories for a number of years. And so I'm humbled to be here reading in front of him and at his invitation, so it's a great pleasure. I'm going to read a little bit from the book, from the stories, The End of the Straight and Narrow, and then I'm going to read a little bit of nonfiction, an essay called Hydrophobia. The End of the Straight and Narrow, as I've been talking about over the last 2 days, gets its name from the gospel. I forget exactly where in the Bible it comes from, but straight and narrow is the path to heaven. And I wanted to depict people who do their best to do the right thing. They try their hardest to live on this straight and narrow path, and somewhere along the way they go wrong. Oftentimes, due to circumstances beyond their control, such as a disaster, a fire, a landslide, a hurricane, etc. Sometimes because of their own choices. The story I want to read today is called Landslide. I'm just going to read the first 8 or so pages of it. And this is a story that comes from a small moment in my life a number of years ago. I was still living in Southern California, where I had gone to college and where my father and my stepmother lived. And I'd gone camping with a couple of old friends up on the Central California coast. And on the way home, we were driving along the coast, and we passed a backhoe, one of those sort of big orange industrial machines. And it was sitting next to a big pile of dirt. And I had this image of it clearing away a landslide. This is sort of landslide country. And I wanted to represent that sense of losing your friends, what it means to say goodbye to someone that you love very much. And especially among men, it can be hard to say goodbye to another man that you love very much without it becoming sentimental or corny or somehow weird. Years later, when I started to really work on the story, I wanted to write about a pastor. My stepmother in California is the children's pastor, at least was until she retired, of a rather large church. And I've always been interested in the lives of pastors. They are so often depicted in categorically stereotypical ways, and I wanted to define that as best that I could. And moreover, I wanted to show this pastor's mistake to be something other than a marital or sexual mistake. And so in this case, he is trying to say goodbye, or he's recounting a story in which he's losing a friend and isn't quite aware of the fact that his friend is departing him until he goes back to the story many years later. So, the beginning of Landslide. The earth moved on a narrow bend in the Pacific Coast Highway, about a half-hour north of Cayuco State Beach. It was the kind of place I had seen only in coffee table books on America's great scenic drives. Cypress trees leaned sideways over the cliff's edges, which alone amazed me, and dark bushes of chaparral speckled with yellow and purple carpeted the hills. Driving home that way after playing golf had been Greg's idea, and when the traffic backed up, I had no idea what we were in for. It was an El Nino year, and a deluge of rain had saturated the soil and overfilled the runoff channels. Down in Los Angeles, the concrete riverbeds ran full for the first time I could remember. A small earthquake, maybe 2.5 on the Richter, too small to feel, was all it took to send who knows how many tons of mud and rocks tumbling down the gully, wiping out the road, and pouring over the side of the cliff of the little rocky beach 100 feet below. I have said in the countless times that I've told this story that it was higher than that, more like 1,000 feet, but it was 100. I'm trying to stay true to the facts. Debris piled up on the highway, sloping toward the edge of the road, aligned with the hillside. A blonde graph was missing from the otherwise brown hill above. How anyone could have survived getting buried beneath it is something I can only explain as the grace of God. However, people did survive, at least for a while, and somehow managed to call for help. This is one aspect of the story that seems improbable, and I am not quite clear on the details. It is what I heard at the time, and being awestruck by the mound of earth I had walked nearly a mile from our parked car to see, I didn't think to question it. Greg and I arrived to see people already digging, one man with a short-handled shovel, and the rest, maybe a dozen others, using tire irons and buckets to pound and scoop away the dirt. A woman was bent forward with her hair in her face, scooping between her legs with her hands, while a man in a green cap stood beside the door of his Dodge Ram, talking into the square receiver of the CB. The coil stretched absolutely out of the cord. I could see other people standing on the other side of the road, a crowd mirroring ours, but I couldn't hear their voices. The slide was a massive, consuming wave of tree roots and earth and rock that had crashed over the roadway, and all that lay beyond it seemed like a different country. We were there for 2 minutes before the highway patrol arrived, a single car driven by a single officer with close-cropped hair and a yellow windbreaker over his beige uniform. When he stepped up to the edges of the road and looked down at the beach, his sleeves flapped in the wind and pressed against his arms and torso, revealing the bulk of the bulletproof vest beneath his shirt. He appeared worried, which is an easy emotion to spot from far away. He rubbed his jaw with the heel of his palm and looked back and forth between the slide and the edge. He couldn't have been much older than I was at the time, but it was his responsibility to take control of the situation. He returned to his cruiser and sat down in the front seat and then spoke to us over the PA, kindly asking everyone to get back. He even said, "Please." Composing himself, he explained that the slide wasn't stable, and that a simple shift could send more earth cascading down. He asked people in the crowd to go back and wait at their cars. Those digging ignored him and kept right on with what they were doing. Greg and I wanted to help. It seemed better than just standing around. But despite every good Samaritan impulse within us, every urge to sacrifice ourselves for the sake of strangers, neither of us was about to disobey the police. A line of cars ahead of us tried to turn around and head back, but it wasn't long before a second officer rode by on a motorcycle and announced that the lane needed to stay open so emergency crews could get through. The road we were on was now closed, and an officer was posted at the turnoff. Anyone caught trying to go back before we were directed to would be ticketed. At that point, people surrendered to the wait, and though I was impatient to get home, I prayed I would surrender too. People unfolded chairs and blankets and set out food, intent on picnicking. It wasn't the worst spot for such things. I heard 8 different radios tuned to 8 different stations, at least 2 of them in Spanish. A few hundred yards ahead of us in line, 4 young boys stood shoulder to shoulder, throwing rocks over the water, doing all they could to outthrow each other. This gave Greg the idea to hit a few balls. He popped the trunk and unsheathed his 3-iron and got out his grocery sack filled with chipped up balls from the driving range where he'd worked the previous summer. The balls were going to be thrown out. He never would have taken them without permission. The back of our dorm faced a grassy slope, too steep to build on, which bottomed out at a junior high soccer field. Greg drove balls from the hill whenever he was bored or had a problem he couldn't figure out. One of the many things about him I never fully understood. That morning, I played my first full round of golf at a tiny public course outside Paso Robles, about 100 miles west of Bakersfield, where we'd attended a wedding the night before. Golf was a sport I never had much talent for, and on that day especially, I found it required much greater patience and concentration than I had been prepared to give. But the book of James instructs us to consider it joy when we encounter various trials, so I committed myself to learning, at least for the day. I played with an old set of clubs borrowed from Greg's uncle. Greg taught me to grip the club with my thumbs down, to square my shoulders with my hips with the ball, and to go through this routine each time I stepped up to hit. One deviation and the ball went into the water or the trees or into the great vineyard beyond the course's perimeter. We took a break at the turn to eat lunch. 2 gigantic cheeseburgers spilling with lettuce and shredded carrots and potato chips and a dill spear that stained the paper plate green. When we were finished, Greg leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. His spiked shoes crossed one over the other, his fingers interlaced across the stomach of his powder blue golf shirt. I'd seen him sleep this way, in the library and in the basilica, our study commons, and seated at his desk in our dorm room. His sleep, even at night, appeared like a brief interlude between two greater, more consequential thoughts. I putted on the practice green while I waited for him to wake up. The shoulder beside the car was 6 feet wide and covered in weedy grass. Greg chopped at it with the head of his club in high strokes, like a reaper, until he cleared a small patch of dirt. He dropped 2 balls in the grass and pulled one back toward himself with his club head, then squared up, dug his shoes into the dirt, and did that thing that always made me laugh, no matter how many times I saw it, the little waggle of his butt that made him look like a duck. "Quack, quack," I said. "Quiet," he said. He kept his eyes fixed on the ball, then wound back and crushed it. The ball swam upward in the mist and carried forward against the stretched blue horizon. A white speck I lost for a moment in the sun and found again in time to watch it splash. The water near the shore was green-blue and full of rocks, fallen chunks of the cliff deposited by earlier landslides. I wondered how many God had placed there himself when he created the earth, and on which day, and it gave me pause to think of the care God took with each minuscule detail. Greg's ball landed in the dark blue. "Nice shot," I said. "See the spot you want to hit before you even swing. Make the ball go where you tell it," he said. He pushed the second ball my way. "Let's see what you got." "Haven't I seen this in a movie?" I said. "2 guys hitting golf balls into the ocean." "It's a beer commercial," he said. "The guys are in business suits playing hooky from work or something like that. 'One more for old times' is the slogan." He lifted an invisible beer and I did the same. We mimed the clink and swig. Then I tried to mime what I'd seen him do only a minute before. The grip, the stance, and the waggle. I kept my head down and swung. The club nicked the top of the ball and sent it bouncing over the edge of the cliff. Greg fished another ball out of the sack and tossed it to me. Without scorn or sarcasm, he said, "Take a mulligan. That one never happened." The mulligan was my favorite thing about golf. It was the perfect example of the first 2 verses of Psalm 32. "Blessed is he whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord does not count against him." Greg and I were seniors at Southland Pacific University, a Christian college perched on a hill on the south side of Los Angeles. Southland Pacific was an innocuous name for a conspicuous place. There wasn't a corner of the campus that lacked Christian intent or import. A wealthy judge had donated the land 70 years before to establish a school that would be, quote, "a light to the world." Our chapel was in fact shaped like a lighthouse. We joked that the water fountains were clean enough for baptism, and we had 1,000 meetings for the initials SPU, Student Pastors University, Sowing and Planting University, Savior's Pride University, Start Packing University. Almost every student spent time in the mission field. We never ran out of names. The most of us just called it SPU. For more than math, which was Greg's major, or history, which was mine, or any other discipline, we were taught the gospel, how to memorize whole New Testament books, verse by verse, mnemonic exercises to help us quote them on command, ways to link the 50 major Messianic Old Testament prophecies to Jesus, techniques for sharing Jesus with everyone we met. Professor Tolliver ended each pagan psychology class with the admonition, "Love your neighbor, share your faith." While other college kids went to Santa Monica or Tijuana to drink and score, we went to witness. Our scores were measured not in phone numbers or drinks, but in souls. The tally of those I saved recorded on a sheet of paper taped to my closet door. One of my best lines was, "Heaven is like a party. God hands out invitations years in advance, and all you have to do is RSVP." It worked more times than you might think. I had a way with analogies and anecdotes, but back then I didn't call them anecdotes. Back then I called them parables. I practiced my parables on the youth at Fisher's Church, just down the hill from SPU, where I interned my senior year. The name came from Pastor Dale Fisher, who founded the church in his living room, but also from Mark chapter 1, verse 17, when Jesus tells Simon and Andrew, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Fisher's was a church for the unchurched, an antidote to the hymn-bloated, wood pew, fire and brimstone services most pagans associated with religion. As Pastor Dale said, which I've said many times myself, we weren't religious, we were relational. We came to church to be with Jesus. We didn't sing hymns, we sang praise songs, led by a band instead of a choir. Fisher's was already one of the largest churches in California, though in my lifetime I would see it become one of the largest churches in the country. and the complex that seemed self-expansive to me then would become too small for Sundays. Youth activities took place in a series of trailers on the north side of the church property, a square encampment that included several classrooms, an all-purpose room filled with sagging second-hand sofas and out-of-date movie posters, and a worship room where we held something of a pseudo-service during the second hour. I was focused and enthusiastic. Each week, I regaled the youth with stories of God's presence revealed in daily life. I told the story of my neighbor in Escondido, who scraped and saved to afford a hot tub so he could relax after work. And when it at last arrived, he gave it to his aunt, who'd recently had hip surgery. It wasn't exactly true. My neighbor had plenty of money and in fact owned the house his aunt lived in. But as a story, it worked. Kids could be so consumed with themselves, with their hair and shoes and that month's brand of blue jeans. The little airbrushing of the details could be justified if it led them to sacrifice for others as Christ sacrificed for us. Everyone understands that the parables of Jesus were intended for this purpose, not as a record of historical facts, as is true with the rest of the Bible. I spent the entire year looking for stories I could shape into parables, watching the sun rise and set from the edge of Spew Hill, watching students talk outside the library, watching hour after hour of television reruns for some plot line, some scene that would strike a relevant chord. I wrote everything down in a 5-subject spiral notebook. My internship ended with the completion of my degree, and as a graduation gift, Pastor Dale had asked me to preach that Sunday at the 10 o'clock service. Maybe it comes from living just south of Hollywood, but I felt that tomorrow would be my big break as a preacher, a giant leap in my pastoral career. I could feel the Holy Spirit pointing me down my triumphant path. I told Greg I should try to find a way to work this into my sermon. "What's that?" he said. He kept his eyes on the ball. The wind lifted the hair on his forehead. "This," I said, "all of this." I waved the club handle at the sky and the sea like Moses extending his staff. Sometimes God blocks our paths to force us to wait on Him. Usually it means we have a lesson to learn, and until we learn it, we can't go forward. Sometimes that lesson is patience itself. If you hadn't taken that cat nap at lunch, we could have been 1 more mile down the road. We should give thanks and praise for God's perfect timing. "Sounds good," he said. He blinked, lost his concentration, and straightened his back. "You know why golf balls are dimpled?" he asked. I shrugged. "So they'll sit on the tee?" "They create magnus lift," he said, which keeps the ball aloft during the initial part of its flight. He picked up the ball. Driven balls have backspin. Magnus force relates to the drag on the top and bottom parts of the ball. "Balls have tops and bottoms," I said, playing along. Greg was full of stuff like this. "They're round. At any one point in time, there's a top and bottom," he said. "The top moves slowly and produces less drag. The bottom moves fast and produces more. This force creates lift. You've seen a golf ball fly upward or slice to the side? That's Magnus." "Something new every day," I said, and spread my arms. "Our blemishes propel us toward God. Perfect." Unaware of anything I just said, he drew the iron up and over his head and swung hard, turning his hips when he made contact with the ball. A tuft of grass and earth flew up and disappeared off the side of the road, and Greg tapped the grass around the divot with the club head. And I'll stop there for this particular segment. I'm in a bit of uncharted territory now. I have not yet read from this essay, Hydrophobia. And to be honest, I haven't read much nonfiction in a very long time. So I'm going down on a limb and I'm taking a risk, as it were. This is an essay called Hydrophobia, which you can probably figure out the meaning just from the word itself, a fear of water. I've been writing recently a number of nonfiction essays about a number of different topics. Religion is one of them, family is another. Swimming, which is one of my lifelong passions, is yet another. And about 3 years ago, I left Salt Lake City, where I had lived for 7 years, and moved to Appleton, Wisconsin, in northeast Wisconsin, to take a job at a small college, Lawrence University. And I quickly realized an important difference between Wisconsin and Utah. Utah is sloped and dry. Wisconsin is rather flat and moist. Not nearly as moist as Louisiana, but nevertheless it can be quite humid. And the first week that I was there, my toilet began to leak. And so I went to the hardware store and I I talked to the guy about how to fix it, and he said, well, here's how you replace the wax ring. It's the seal that joins the pipe with the toilet. And here's how you fix it. It only costs $3 for the parts. And so I brought it home, and I took the whole toilet apart, and I tried to put it back on very carefully, and I took 20 minutes to tighten the toilet back down. And I called my dad, and I said, do you think I got it right? He said, probably. Kind of rock back on the toilet and see if you've got it anchored. And when I did, I sort of sat back on my heels, and the whole toilet came up with the ring and the screws and the whole top of the pipe. I had broken like the whole pipe to the sewer in my house, and had to have the plumber come. And I was, totally freaked out by this. We were, my wife had left her job to go to Wisconsin. We didn't have a ton of extra cash. She was brand newly pregnant with our second child, a second surprise pregnancy. And for some weird reason, this small event began a sort of chain reaction for me of feeling very anxious about water in my house. I found mold in the basement. I would lie in bed and feel like I heard water dripping in the walls and through the faucets. It's a 60-year-old house, and so things are bound to get leaky from time to time. And probably had something to do with the fact that I was brand new in my first job as a professor. I didn't know if I was doing a good job or not. My wife was pregnant. She wasn't sure about Wisconsin. I wasn't sure about being a homeowner, and I just began to get very anxious. And I felt like for a while I was starting to go nuts. So I decided to write about this particular fear, and then more generally, madness. And so I'm going to read a couple sections of this. You're going to hear, as we move through madness, a story about my second son's pregnancy. I will preface everything by saying he is fine. He's 2 now, and he's a big, rowdy, rambunctious, red-headed little kid. So fear not. As the husband of a social worker, I have been a proxy witness to myriad forms of madness. Since we've had Galen, which is our older son, Catherine has borne a much greater professional burden than have I, often requesting the night shifts so that she can be home during the day. She sleeps with a pager beneath her pillow, ready to be rattled awake at any moment by a call from the crisis hotline, the number of people call when their demons have them cornered. The pager chirps and she answers, groping in the dark for her robe and slipping down to the kitchen, to the phone, and the table, and her notebook. She makes notes while her callers talk and tries not to interrupt too early or too often. Sometimes she'll advise a caller to go to the hospital, but sometimes the person just needs an ear to speak into. On occasion, her voice drifts back to me beneath the bedroom door, and on other nights, I make my way down to see her sitting toward the windows, nodding and scribbling, fully present at 2 in the morning, at 3, and at 4. It's okay, I hear her say. You're not a freak. You're just going through a lot. It's only been a few months since he died. I try to imagine her cowards sitting against their bathroom doors with their knees tucked up to their chins, or at kitchen tables not unlike ours. In their fear and trembling, they are my brothers and sisters. Once in Utah, the call came from our neighbor 3 doors down, a young mother with a sick infant. Her daughter had been in and out of the hospital more than a dozen times in 6 months with hip dysplasia, a string of unexplainable infections and sleep apnea that one night caused her to stop breathing. Our neighbor did CPR to revive her and then rushed her to the hospital. The baby lived, but the mother was afraid to sleep for fear that she'd wake up to find her daughter dead. Catherine recognized her name and the sound of her voice. She looked out our front window and saw her kitchen light on, saw the woman pacing back and forth in her nightgown, her blonde hair in a ponytail. Catherine did not identify herself beyond her first name. She did not say, "Hey, it's me from down the street, look out your kitchen window." Nor did she keep looking out our kitchen window. She sat down and she listened. The next day was sunny and our neighbor was outside, pushing her daughter in the stroller up and down the block. Catherine wanted to invite her in, reveal herself, become the friend she knew she could be and had in many ways already become. But she couldn't. It's against the rules. When the hospital wakes her up, chances are she'll be going in. A patient needs a psychiatric assessment before being admitted or discharged. Psychiatrists don't like coming in to the hospital in the middle of the night, so the task is given to the social worker. Catherine dresses in the dark, brushes her hair, and drives to the empty streets to the hospital. I don't like the thought of her car alone on the road, and I'm always a little scared when she goes. I've considered calling the police to ask them to keep an eye out. Yet I've also grown so accustomed to the pager that some nights I dream right through it. Catherine leaves without me even turning over, and sometime later I wake up to find her already gone, to the paralyzing realization of what it would be like to lose her. One night, just after Thanksgiving, she arrived home late and woke me up. Her eyes and the tip of her nose glowed in the moonlight through the slits of the blinds. I was stuffed still with dinner, the turkey and mashed potatoes like a weight in my stomach, but her look told me I needed to sit up, so I sat up. She had gone to the hospital to assess a patient whom the police had found at a stop sign screaming, "H2, H2." He told her he'd been eating Thanksgiving dinner with his girlfriend's family when the argument escalated into a fight. He'd thrown a glass against the wall and stormed out of the house, tearing off his shirt as he descended the front steps. Catherine recognized his girlfriend from high school, a disheveled but pretty blonde, who had once swum on the swimming team. The patient wore his hair cut short and was clean-shaven. With his shirt off, Catherine could see the topography of veins in his neck, chest, and stomach. He was compact and muscular. Velcro cuffs around his wrist held him to the bed. He admitted to having a history of schizophrenia. He had stopped taking his medications because they didn't do him any good. He still heard voices. Catherine said the psychiatrist could prescribe him a different drug that might work better, and a sleep aid so he could get some rest. He said he didn't want a different drug. He wanted to leave. His parents were jerks, and his girlfriend's parents were jerks, and the police were jerks. Catherine asked him if he had used other drugs, and his girlfriend admitted they used ecstasy. Catherine could see the muscles in his chest and arms begin to contract, slowly, like a python tightening its stranglehold. He made a fist and flexed his wrist, testing the strength of the cuff. "We'll need to run some tests," Catherine said. "Draw some blood." "Am I going to stay here?" he wanted to know. "We have a psychiatric unit at another facility. They're better equipped. You'll be a lot more comfortable," she said. "Can I drive him?" his girlfriend asked. "An ambulance would be better," Catherine said. "If she let them go, there's a good chance they wouldn't show up at the other hospital." "I don't want to go in an ambulance," the patient said. "It's better," Catherine said. "Safer." She sat back on the bed and took a deep breath before telling me how the tech came in to draw the blood and could not tap the vein with the cuffs around the man's wrists, how the tech unfastened the restraints, how the moment his wrists were free, the patient sprang from his back to his knees in one fluid, adrenaline-injected motion, both hands reaching for Catherine's neck. Had he made it, he could have crushed her windpipe. Fortunately, the tech stuck out his arm, and within seconds, hospital security was in the room. The patient was on his back again, and his wrists were restrained. "He never laid a finger on me," Catherine said, "but he got close enough that I knew what it would have felt like if he had. I felt the air leave his nose. I could smell the cranberry sauce on his breath." The euphemisms for madness in the American vernacular, nervous breakdown, cracked up, lost as marbles, all connote a process in which the mind breaks away from the common sense world where the normal live and takes up residence in a country without logic, a little mental Madagascar, where change comes on suddenly without warning, where the laws of linearity and orderliness no longer apply. The madman sees things that aren't there. The madman chitters in a language only he can understand. The images of mental illness that pervade American popular culture, often portrayed as generally embarrassing brands of craziness, reinforce the idea. Bipolars vacillate between manic rage and closed-curtain depression, as in Mommy Dearest. Schizophrenics slavishly obey their inner voices, like a beautiful mind. Obsessive-compulsives repeat the same hand-washing ritual until their skin turns cracked and flaky, like it's as good as it gets. Scroll the higher numbered cable channels after 10 p.m., and chances are you'll come across a movie involving multiple personality disorder, now termed dissociative identity disorder. A villain who is his own victim, his own evil side transmogrified into another self, the me that is not me. Even postmodern theorists John Baudrillard and Frederick Jameson use schizophrenia as a metaphor for the schism between the images that constitute contemporary culture and the meanings those images or signs represent. However, the real-life schizophrenic who lunged at my wife showed me that these metaphors can have it backward. Madness may be less a fracturing than a concentration. a fixation on one thing that becomes the head of the pen upon which the entire universe must balance. The one thing becomes the everlasting thing, a crushing, overwhelming weight that when it fails results not in an explosion, but in an implosion, which leaves behind a black hole that draws to itself all light, hope, peace, and all difference. Madness is the overwhelming persistence of sameness. It is the absence of change. For the man in the hospital, Catherine became the concentrated figure of all the voices that had tried to control him. The voice inside his head, as well as the police, his doctors, his parents, his girlfriend's parents. And when he lunged for her neck, he lunged not at her, but at everyone, all at once. Though neither violent nor controlled by voices, I have become possessed in this way by water. It has saturated every facet of my existence. When I am playing with Galen on the carpet, I am thinking about water. When I am sitting on the couch, feeling Catherine's still flat stomach for echoes of the baby inside it, I am thinking about water. When I am in front of my classes, I am thinking about water. I watch it spiral down the sink and toilet, the invisible tornado it forms in the bathtub, and I am certain that it is somewhere leaking into the walls, that it will rot away the skeleton of my shelter until the walls collapse and the roof buckles and the kitchen cabinets crash to the floor, which too will have rotted and will fall in. I die off the tap and stand touching it, feeling for moisture, paralyzed, hearing Galen call my name but unable to listen. When no more water drips from the faucet, I go away and come back again. I stand watch and I wait. I prowl about the exterior, fixated on the rainwater trickling through the gutters and soaking into the grass and flower beds, and farther, into the pores of the basement walls, seeping through the cinder blocks, the window jambs. I feel the washing machine vibrate to the living room floor and envision it bursting open, water gushing from its seams throughout the basement, knocking out the furnace and the water heater, then ascending the staircase, consuming our shoes and coats and gloves, filling up the portal windows like a capsized ship sinking into the sea. I lie in bed and listen to the creaks in the walls, straining to detect in the dark the sound of a trickle, a drip in the pipes that separate my bedroom from my son's. I run my hands along the fissures in the plaster until my palms grow sweaty and create the very water that I fear. And though I know it has come from me, that I can pull my hand away and make it stop, I fear the water I leave behind. I fear I am the agent of damage, and my madness, not water, will bring the house down around us. And still I cannot pull my hand away, cannot stop feeling for more. How little I know of madness, and how much I will come to learn. We go in for an ultrasound. I sit in a chair against the wall, abstracted. We've done this before. The sonographer squirts gel onto Catherine's belly, and a moment later, on the screen hanging from the ceiling, appears the baby's outline. There's the head, the back, the beating heart, the penis. Catherine has complained that she hasn't felt quite right, and of bleeding. The toilet paper is sometimes pink, other times a brighter red. I tell her she's just nervous because we're in a new place. Nothing is wrong. Even the doctor has told her a little spotting is normal. See, I say, pointing, there he is. A-okay. I'm doing my best to participate, to think about what's before me and nothing else. The sonographer hits a button and the machine spits out a line of waxy black and whites, as well as three sepia-tinted 3D pictures of the baby tucked against Catherine's uterine wall, a face like the face of a tadpole. We go home and call our families and friends. Get ready for another boy, we say. 2 days later, on a Friday morning, I'm sitting in my office when Catherine calls me. Do you have a second, she asked. Sure. The doctor called about the ultrasound, she said. She pauses and swallows. I need to talk to you about what he said. For the next 5 minutes, she stops being my wife and becomes a social worker, the calm and all-weathers woman who has cradled the dead in her arms, dead babies and dead children, who has ferried grieving parents to the morgue and back, who has pressed tiny, lifeless hands and feet into plaster molds in order to give bereft mothers something of their lost children to take home. She takes a big clinical breath and tells me that the ultrasound revealed that the baby is missing a blood vessel in its umbilical cord. It has 2 when it should have 3. She also tells me that cysts were found in his choroid plexus, the membrane in the brain that produces spinal fluid. It's not a cognitive part of the brain, so the cysts won't affect function or development, but the danger is that both the two-vessel cord, and the cord plexus cysts are markers for a genetic disease, trisomy 18, Edwards syndrome. Like Down syndrome, which is trisomy 21, Edwards is caused by the presence of an extra chromosome, a third 18th chromosome. Like Down syndrome, Edwards affects mental and physical development, but with one horrifying difference. While most Down syndrome children live relatively happy lives and survive into their 50s or longer, very few children with Edwards live more than a week. Many are stillborn, and many more die within the first hours of life. I listened to Catherine tell me all of this with my thumb inside Plato's Republic, and when she lets out a long, frightened sigh, a maternal sigh, not a clinical one, I feel my heart tighten like a fist. She has seen enough to know the difference between imagined worry and real concern. This is real. 20 minutes before my first class meets, I feel the implosion begin, the black hole opening, the bottom of the universe spinning through a drain, pulling me down with it. The only way we will know for certain is with an amniocentesis. In the jargon of baby making, most know it by its shorthand, amnio. The waiting room is filled with parenting magazines, every table and empty seat covered with a glossy photograph of a smiling, healthy baby. We find 2 seats around the corner, away from the receptionist's desk. I gather up the magazines and move them away. We sit, staring in silence until the nurse appears in the doorway and calls our name. We follow her to the same room where a week earlier we had the ultrasound. The sonographer this time is a small woman with dark spiky hair. Her lab coat hangs to her ankles. She tells us she's from Reedsburg, Wisconsin, down by the Dells. Appleton feels like the big city to her. Kids, we ask. 3, she says, 2 boys and a girl. She smiles and rolls her eyes toward the ceiling, unable to keep herself from thinking of them. She stops herself from telling stories and instead slathers Catherine's belly with lubricant. There's your baby, she says, excited. It's obvious that she enjoys her job. We wonder if she knows why we're here. The doctor comes in, a diminutive Filipino man in his 50s, still combing the last wisps of his hair on his small round head. He keeps a hand tucked inside his coat pocket. We found him in the phone book the week after we arrived in Wisconsin, but have quickly come to appreciate his unflappable demeanor and the fact that the certifications from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists that hang on the wall are dated 1985. He's been doing this for a long time. He explains the risks of the amnio, infection, acidemia, a loss of amniotic fluid, and in a small percentage of cases, miscarriage. We say we understand the risks. The sonographer wraps the transducer in a plastic sleeve, which he fills with lubricant and tightens into place with the metal clamp. Attached to the clamp is a small slot through which the needle will slide. She moves the transducer along Catherine's belly until she finds a blank spot, a place where the baby is not. A dotted line transects the screen, marking the trajectory of the needle. The needle will follow through the skin and into the uterus. The doctor threads the needle through the hole. Are you ready, he asks. Catherine nods. Okay, he says, I'm going to count to 3 and then go in. You'll feel a pinch and a tightness while the needle is inside. Catherine nods again. Okay then, he says. He counts slowly. 1, followed by a pause. 2. He retracts the needle. He gets the TH out for 3. When the baby's head emerges on the screen, it crosses through the dotted line, right through the needle's path. Of course you'd swim over right now, the doctor says. He laughs lightly. My heart is racing, but I'm sitting still, holding onto Catherine's arm. For once my madness is serving me. I have learned to keep it a secret, to sit without moving, even as my mind spins. The doctor moves the transducer to a new spot and begins the countdown again, more quickly this time. He pierces the uterus and pulls back on the syringe. Catherine winces, grits her teeth. The canister of the syringe fills with a dull yellow fluid. Good color, he says. A little frightening there for a moment. We nod, and I exhale. For you, not for me, he says. Now what, I ask. Now we wait, he says. Results in 10 days. For 10 days, we do not touch. Even when the desire between us is a third person in the room, an animal growling between us in bed, we resist, afraid of recommitting the act that may have created a doomed child. We've been kicking around names for weeks, but now we choose one, Hayden, aware that it is a name we might have to bury. Home after class, I sit on the edge of the bed and think about the vial of amniotic fluid. Catherine's water, traveling by van to the lab in Milwaukee. I think of its soft amber color, its protective viscosity, its blizzard of DNA, the helix of Hayden's existence, a braid of Catherine's alleles and mine. I can't help wondering if I am responsible, if it is my DNA that caused the cysts in the two-vessel cord. Catherine appears in the bedroom doorway. Her eyes are wet. Without ever speaking of it, we've agreed not to reveal our worry to Galen. It is late October, and beyond the window the last yellow leaf flutters on the maple, lit by the sun through the pines beyond the garage. Downstairs, Galen bangs his milk cup against his high chair. The thud echoes up the staircase. We're alone for a moment. She wants to reach for me, and I for her, but we do not. Instead, I lie back on the bed, and she lies down beside me, and we begin to talk. For 10 days, we talked like this, in the mornings lying in bed, and in the evenings sitting on the couch. In the first days, we conjure forth the worst stories we know. Catherine tells stories from the emergency room where she worked with the trauma team, of a 10-year-old girl in American Fork, Utah, hit by a pickup truck while crossing in a crosswalk. She was kept alive for 2 days before support was withdrawn, and her heart was allowed to stop and her organs removed for donation. She tells me of mothers backing over their children, babies shaken to death by immature fathers, otherwise healthy 8-year-olds inexplicably bleeding out while having their tonsils removed. I tell her about my grandmother who slept on her kitchen floor and hit her head on a cabinet drawer and broke her neck, and about a friend who lost his first child to a chromosomal anomaly, not unlike the one Hayden may have. The ultrasound revealed it, the amniocentesis confirmed it, and his wife carried the baby for 9 months, delivered her without medication, and then held her until she died just hours after her birth. It helps us to hear each other speak. We try to remind ourselves that the worst can happen, and has happened to people we know. Children die and their parents survive. If ours dies, we will survive as well. But I believe we also tell these stories out of the more superstitious belief that if we can possess all the horror in the world, gather it to ourselves and identify it as part of us, then we can dispossess our own narrative of its tragedy. We can bargain our way to health by convincing God that we have not been immune to suffering. We've had our numbers called. Let this one be our freebie. As the days pass and our stories begin to change, At first, we hardly notice. The stories are still as gruesome as ever. Babies born with vital organs outside their bodies, car accidents, plane crashes, except that the people we're talking about aren't dead. They're alive. Catherine says that the neonatal intensive care unit in Utah brought kids back in ways she never thought possible. 6 months in the NICU, most of it in the dark, untouched by human skin to prevent infection or the transference of oil, eating and breathing through a tube, but in the end, alive. We begin to see the possibility of a middle ground between dumb luck avoidance of mishap and the suffocating darkness of our worst nightmares. On the 10th day, the day we're to hear about the amnio, we lie in bed and whisper to each other, the mother of all comeback stories. I saw it in the newspaper years ago, the story of a 22-month-old boy who had wandered away from his babysitter in Rexburg, Idaho, and had fallen into a canal. He was underwater for 30 minutes and had floated more than half a mile before the police fished him out, cold and unresponsive. Paramedics at the scene and doctors in the emergency room performed CPR for more than a half hour before finally pronouncing him dead. The boy's mother and stepfather spent more than an hour crying over him and kissing his cold skin and saying goodbye. And when they were finished, a nurse came in and wheeled him down the hall to prepare his body for the funeral home. It was then that she noticed his chest was moving, just a little, and realized that he was breathing. He had been pronounced dead, but he wasn't. He was flown from Rexburg to the Children's Hospital in Salt Lake City, where Catherine learned more details firsthand. He was breathing on his own, but then had to go back on the respirator, she says. About a week later, he was upgraded to fair condition. As far as I know, he made it. We practically giggle while we tell it. We even kiss. It could happen. Sometimes it does happen. Every now and then, someone makes it back from the dead. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much for having me today. Are we finished, or do we have time for questions? Or do we need to? Okay. Forgive me for taking up all the time and not leaving time for questions and answers, but thank you very much again for coming, and I hope to see you next door.
Thank you. That was just a fascinating, engaging reading. Thank you so much. We hope to see all of you in the reception right now and come back to the Michael Martone reading next Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. and the student reading next Friday at noon. Thank you.